Hello, everyone. Welcome. So we're waiting some seconds till everyone is there. So we'll be starting in a minute. Okay, so let's start. Welcome, everyone. So some housekeeping rules for today. Everyone is muted automatically, so please ask your questions in the chat. They will be answered at the end. There are 30 minutes foreseen for the Q&A. Also, the session will be recorded, so if you have any issue with this, let us know and we can blur your name and video. So let's kick off. Well, welcome everyone this series of webinars, to this series of webinars on positive peace and climate change mitigation. So with these 3 webinars, Greenfish and IEP will showcase the link between positive peace, ecological threats, sustainability, and the business world. Today is the first webinar, and we will tackle the question on how positive peace can make business more profitable. And the second webinar, later in February, will deep dive into the question on how peace and environmental issues are connected. And last but not least, the third webinar will discuss on how to engage in positive peace and climate change mitigation. So for today's session, we have 2 speakers. First, Mrs. Flore Andersen, Head of Strategic Advisory at Greenfish, and Mr. Steve Killelea, Founder and Executive Chairman of Institute of Economic and Peace. I will now leave the floor to Flore Andersen for the opening speech.
Thank you, Manon. I think whichever way you look at it, there seems to be a strong link between peace and sustainability. We can see it with what's happening recently in countries like Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, and others in and around the Horn of Africa that have seen an increase in droughts in the recent years as a result of poor and disrupted rainy seasons. This is resulting in water scarcity in this region and therefore a lack of food, as you can imagine. As a result, today, around 13 million people in this area suffer from hunger. I'm sure you can understand that this puts a huge stress on communities and is resulting in increased friction and increased conflict in that area. Now, why am I talking about the Horn of Africa? Because I think it's a very simple illustration of the impact of climate change on society. Climate change, we know it, is disrupting weather patterns and the water cycle. We're seeing, as I've just talked about, an increase in water scarcity, but also an increase in the contamination of fresh water supplies. This means that it's becoming more and more difficult to access safe drinking water across the globe. We might not see this immediately in our countries, probably because our supply chains are more complex and longer, and also because through modernization, we've become more and more distanced from our limited resources. Let's be honest, most of us live like resources are unlimited. We have no view of our impact and our use of them. Yet in Belgium, the country I'm located in, we're at a high risk of water scarcity. This might be strange because for those of you who are in Belgium, you've clearly noticed that it's been raining a lot lately, but this is why I'm talking about water scarcity and not droughts. The total amount of water that's been falling in Belgium hasn't changed, but the pattern of the rains has changed recently. We're seeing more erratic rains, more intense and less frequent rains. This means that the water doesn't have time to seep into the soil and groundwater levels are decreasing. So despite a stable, stable total amount of water falling on the country, we are not as a country able to retain that water. That means that we are indeed seeing water scarcity in our regions. Now, building on that, I'd like to talk a little bit about what the International Growth Center is saying. They are saying that for every 1 degree Celsius increase in temperature, we're seeing an increase in conflict between individuals, so assault, murder, etc., of 2.4%, and between groups, so riots, civil wars, of 11.3%. These are just two numbers, but there are many more studies pointing in the same direction. With these examples, I'm talking about the link between the environment and conflict, but as we will see in this series of webinars, peace is so much more than just the absence of conflict. And this is something that Steve will introduce with the concept of positive peace and the 8 pillars of positive peace. And I'd like you to listen to his speech and try to think about how this compares with the sustainability frameworks that we know. So the P, people, profit, planet, the 17 sustainable development goals. And I think you will see that there are really clear and strong links between these two concepts. To me, it's a reminder that as a society, we are dependent on the environment we live in, but we're also actors of that environment. So it's a strong two-way relationship. That's what I hope we will be able to show you in this series of webinars. I'm talking about we. Who are we? These webinars are hosted by the Institute for Economics and Peace together with Greenfish. Greenfish is a sustainable engineering and consulting company. We focus on accompanying our clients through their sustainable transformation with the hope of creating a sustainable and profitable future for all. While we work on carbon accounting, waste management, CSR strategies, we're truly aware that sustainability is not limited to those. It's a much broader concept that encompasses everything and everyone. As a matter of fact, I think, and I hope that if you talk to any Greenfisher, they will tell you that we cannot achieve environmental sustainability without social justice. This is why we're joined today by the Institute for Economics and Peace, or IEP, which is a global think tank that's developed different frameworks defining peacefulness and uncovering the relationship between peace, business, and prosperity. Their mission is to create a paradigm shift in the way the world thinks about peace. We've just touched upon it. Peace is not just the absence of conflict. And they're best known for their Global Peace Index, which is a benchmark measuring peace levels in different countries. Talking about IEP, we are joined today by Steve Killelea, who's the founder and executive chairman of the Institute for Economics and Peace. He will talk to you about the concept of positive peace, showing that it indeed goes further than the absence of violence, and he will look at the attitudes, structures, institutions that are necessary to sustain peaceful societies. On this note, Steve, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Well, I'll just throw my share up, throw my screen up, and we'll share it. Now I have a presentation which I'll give here. Can we see that now? Can everyone see that?
Yes, yes, okay, thank you, Steve.
So basically what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about positive peace, but I'll move very quickly into the relationship between positive peace in business, which I think is of interest to everyone on the call. But first up, a little bit about the Institute for Economics and Peace. It was set up to understand the intersection between business, peace and economics, and places special emphasis on metrics to measure peace, then ascribe an economic value to changes in peace. We're a global organisation headquartered in Sydney, Australia, but we have offices in New York, Mexico City, Brussels, Den Haag, and Harare in Zimbabwe. The Institute, which works with most of the major multilaterals, we do a lot of extensive amount of research, full paid research for them. And some of the people we do that for is people like the OECD, Commonwealth Secretariat, World Bank, United Nations, Microsoft, and many, many more. Our work's now included in thousands of university courses around the world. And we get over 200,000 download loads of our reports off our website each year, but probably because it's also carried in other places, that'll be up over 500,000. Place a lot of emphasis on media. We had 24 billion media impressions last year. Social reach was nearly 1 billion. And it was about 20,000 news articles, and we're referenced in 3,000 different pieces of scientific research now. Now, we've got a whole range of products, and I've just listed the major ones here. The Global Peace Index, which is the world's leading measure on global peacefulness. The Global Terrorism Index, that's used by just about all the major intelligence organisations around the world. Ecological Threat Register, that's something which Serge will be talking to in another couple of weeks. Got a website, Vision of Humanity. We also put out a weekly newsletter, which looks at future trends of events happening in the news. That's got about 60,000 readership. We've got a various number of academies around peace where we train people. We've got an ambassadors program. In fact, we're training 1,000 people in Nigeria as we speak. We've probably now trained over 4,000 people globally, including 400 in Ethiopia last year. And tonight we've got Positive Peace, which is the business and peace part, which I'm talking about, which is one part of that. So let's have a quick look at what is positive peace. So positive peace is the attitude, institutions and structures which create and sustain peaceful societies. We get to it through the Global Peace Index, which is a measure of what's termed negative peace. We then use statistical analysis against 80,000 different data sets, indexes and attitudinal surveys to determine the factors which are most statistically connected with peace, and also use a lot of mathematical modelling to get there. That all operates as a system, consists of 8 different pillars. None of them are counterintuitive, but they all come together to create a system. So quite often when you see interventions, even when they're holistic, you'll find that they quite often might focus on 3, possibly 4 of the pillars, but rarely do they focus on all 8. So the things like sound business environment, well-functioning government, equitable distribution of resources, free flow of information, which could be epitomised by a free press, good relationships with neighbours, high levels of human capital, acceptance of other people's rights, and low levels of corruption. So positive peace is statistically associated with higher per capita income, which is what we'll spend most of this presentation on. Societies which are much more resilient, got better environmental outcomes. The higher the positive peace, the better environmental outcomes. Performs better on measures of well-being and happiness, and better on measures of development as well in the classical sense. So now, just a couple of quick, now I'm going to move through some stats quickly and come down to a number of charts which back it all up. So for every one index point we find an improvement in positive peace, we get a 10-fold rise in GDP. Understand the scale, this is on as about 1 to 5. So that doesn't mean a lot, but as we drill down now, I think it will mean a lot. So if we're looking at household consumption, grows twice as fast in countries improving in positive peace compared to countries which are deteriorating. The growth in business activity is twice higher in countries which are improving in positive peace compared to ones which are deteriorating, and that was over the prior decade. We find inflation rates are 4 times more volatile in countries where positive peace is deteriorating compared to countries where it's increasing. Net foreign investment inflows as a percentage of GDP are twice as big in countries, again, which are high in peace compared to countries which are low in peace. So now, if we look at it, the GDP growth rates is 33% higher for countries improving in positive peace compared to the global average. And so so if you take an investment portfolio and you're tracking it against the countries which are improving in positive peace, in theory, you get a 33% higher return. Corporate profits were 27% higher in countries improving in positive peace, again, compared to the global average. And international trade was 30% higher in countries improving in positive peace, again, when compared to the global average. And again, we come back to capital investment, very, very similar sorts of percentages. So capital investment's 32% higher in countries improving in positive peace relative to countries to deteriorate. So you can see all of this was in a 27 to 33% band. And so all these factors track together. Now, violence has an effect on the economy. So each year we put out a study which looks at the cost of violence to the global economy. So we go back and we have a look in 2020, it was $14.4 trillion. That's about 10.5% of global GDP. Now, it's hard for us to imagine a world which is totally peaceful, but we can all imagine a world which is about 10% more peaceful. That'd be equivalent to 1.4 trillion. So what does that actually mean? That's the equivalent of adding 3 economies of 3 new countries to the world, the equivalent of Ireland, Switzerland, and Denmark. Another way of looking at it also is 1%. I mean, 1% of that $14.4 trillion is about the same amount which was spent on all overseas developmental aid in 2020. So we're talking big amounts. So we start to look at the breakup of it. What we find is that most of the money is spent on internal security and the military. Now, the military and internal security we can count. There are a whole lot of things left out of this analysis we can't count. And if we could count them, my belief is this cost would be about 50% higher. Now, let's have a little bit more look at some of the detail here. So now, from this, you can see that the countries that are improving in positive peace, or the countries, as you start to look at the GDP growth rates, and you go back a number of years looking at this, we find that the very high peace countries, 2.8%, we can see as the peace drops off, the GDP growth rate also drops off. So you get to very low peace countries, it's 0.8%. Now, ease of doing business, it's an indicator from the World Bank, which many people use in terms of making business assessments. So the correlation rate with that is exceptionally strong at 0.7. We're looking at the domestic credit. Again, we see that it's a really strong relationship between the levels of credit, statistical relationship between the levels of credit and the safety and security domain, which is in the Global Peace Index. So again, you can come back and you also find it with sort of the efficiency of the legal system. And so if we look at this, what we find is that you've got well-developed and efficient institutions. You've got other socioeconomic factors, which you can see in the positive peace, that come together to produce higher levels of peace. When you've got higher levels of peace, you've got laws which support fair regulation. So example, free flow of information, for example, out of positive peace. That just means it's better able to assess the value of a transaction because the information's flowing into the public markets, as you'd see with a well-regulated share market. And so as the judicial system becomes less encumbered by, let's say, corruption, a secrecy, or a crime, it improves the efficiency of the businesses. And that sort of is really very important. So now if we come back and we now just look at a couple of correlations around this. So the safety and security domain, that comes out of, again, out of the Global Peace Index. So the ease of resolving insolvencies, got high correlations and statistical correlations with time recovered to resolve insolvencies, the efficiency of the legal system in settling disputes, and the ability to enforce contracts. So now, also, positive peace can be used as a predictor of future performance. So if we're looking at just the correlation with GDP per capita income and positive peace, you get a 0.9 correlation. That's exceptionally high. So you can see these factors again, which create for peace, create for higher income as well. We come back and look at the, as I mentioned earlier on, we come back and look at the growth in household consumption. Again, you can see it's twice as high. The countries which improve in positive peace compared to ones which deteriorate. And again, we can see a similar sort of thing with the volatility of inflation, where it's 4 times higher in countries which are deteriorating in positive peace compared to countries which are improving. So again, you see a similar sort of thing with foreign direct investment. So here you see a relationship here. In countries which are deteriorating, you can still see there's agricultural, forestry and fishing's value add. That sort of holds up. But when we're looking at industrialisation and manufacturing, they are very, very much underperform. Again, you can see it with the long-term inflation rates. Again, you can see the volatility there. And that's 1 over time, covering the last 60 years. So now you can also see that the trends in interest rates are very, very much the same. So if we look at the bottom blue line, that's very high peace countries. We look at the very top red line, that's very low peace countries. And again, you can see how the interest rates track with the levels of peace. Similar sorts of things with foreign direct investment. So the red line again is very low. You can see very low rates of the foreign direct investment. We're very high, and high peace countries have, over the last 30 years have had much higher rates of foreign direct investment. Might just split that slide. It's a bit technical. Now, this is, I find, one of the more interesting slides. So if you look at GDP growth, and this is over a 10-year period. So we just took GDP growth of all countries and took the average. Then we look at the average of positive peace improvers. And you can see over the decade we've gone here, it's 148, increased 48%. Compared to 36%. So that's a 12 difference, and 12 over 36 is a 33% improvement. And that's, if you're looking at investment portfolios, that's an awful lot of outperformance. And again, if we look at the profitability of firms, we get a very, very similar outcome again. So now let's come back and have a look at some of the ethical investment. So positive peace in many ways is an accurate predictor of future outcomes in ethical investment standards. So that's ESG. So we all know the relationship between ESGs and profits, but how can you determine where the best outcome is going to be in your future ESG? So by looking positive peace, we look at the indexes using ES scores from Morgan Stanley Investment Management or Mellon, we find that, or Aberdeen, we find that these correlation rates are extremely high. So future trends in sovereign ESG scores are likely to follow the historical trends in positive peace. So that gives you a predictor of which countries are likely to improve best in the future. And again, if you look at this, the correlation with it, it's incredibly strong, 0.8, and it's a very, very tight relationship as well. The bottom Left hand is more peaceful countries, more developed. The bottom right-hand corner is less developed, less peaceful countries. So you can see that relationship really clearly between development and peace. And similarly, you see the same sort of thing with the Aberdeen Emerging Markets Index. And also, we come back, now we look at the correlations with the Morgan Stanley investment managers, the sovereign ESG rankings. You see a relationship there between each of the pillars of positive peace. But the key thing here is the overall score performs better than any of the single indicators. What that does is it comes back to a concept in systems theory, which this presentation is not about. It's that a system is more than the sum of its parts. And so what this shows is that when looking at positive peace, it works as a system, and all the parts come together to create something more than what the sum of the individual parts would do. Now, these are the countries which are most likely to improve in the future. Moving forward, this is calculated in 2009. And so a number of them are fairly interesting countries. Some of them you'd expect to see there, like UAE, South Korea, Malaysia. But Côte d'Ivoire is a little bit exceptional, as is Armenia and Kosovo. And that, my friends, is the end of the presentation. Oh, and if you're interested in more about this, I have written a book called Peace in the Age of Chaos. So I might just give a short plug on my book. So it covers the entrepreneurial journey and how you go about creating a think tank. My background's actually in business. I set up 2 international companies. First one ended up public listed on NASDAQ and the second on the Australian Stock Exchange. So I made a lot of money out of that. And I set up a family foundation which works with the poorest of the poor. That's how I got interested in peace. It took me a lot of war zones, near post-war zones, because that's where the poorest people live. And so the book covers the entrepreneurial story in creating a global think tank. A lot of my personal adventures in some of the more remote and wilder parts of the world and how that have influenced my views on peace, and also covers the work of the Institute for Economics and Peace. All right, now that, my friends, is the end of one very fast presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Right, I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Yes, thank you very much for this insightful presentation. And we have some questions. So let's start with this one. Mr. Steve Killelea, do you have examples of countries that have seen a massive change, increase or decrease in positive peace?
Yes, look, positive peace, I've come back, it changes slowly, okay? It's one of those things which are about building societies, changes fairly slowly over time. One of the more interesting ones, and like we went back 3 years ago, Belarus had one of the bigger increases in positive peace. Now, that's going to fade away over the next couple of years, I imagine, or fall away, but that was one. Another, and I'm picking ones which are counterintuitive at the moment, just to give you an idea, is that predicting the future sometimes can be hard. The other one was Burma. It was, or Myanmar, it was going very, very well as well. So Côte d'Ivoire would be another example of Georgia, another 2 examples of countries which have had the big increases in positive peace. So now, the stronger the positive peace, the harder it is to actually improve. And so quite often countries which are coming out of bad environments can have big increases. So what we've seen with the Eastern European countries, a lot of them over the last decade have improved really quite well in their positive peace. But obviously they're coming off a much lower base than Western Europe.
Okay, thank you. And well, the next question is, do you only provide analysis in national level or also sub-national?
Yes, with that we do do both. So we produce a Mexico Peace Index each year, which is considered the Mexico, the major measure of peace each year. That gets a lot of publicity. We also work out of that with a number of different state governments in Mexico as well. So other things we can geocode, let's say the Global Terrorism Index or the Ecological Threat Register, because we can geocode down to very, very low levels there. So for all terrorist attacks, and we've got about 7,000 in this year's, 7,500, 11,000 instances in this year's report, which we're in the process of producing now. And so we'd go down and geocode that, and we have thermal maps then where you can go down and you can see exactly where at a subnational level where it occurs. And so if you go over to the Sahel and Serge Strobens, he'll be talking more about this next week, but if you go over to the Sahel, what you see when you look at the terrorist attacks, they're on the borders of countries, okay? And why is the reason for that? That's because a lot of these countries like Mali, Guinea-Bissau, Chad, you find that the governments are fairly weak. And so the further they stretch out from the capital, the harder it is for them to control territory.
Okay, thank you again for the clear answer. Another question is if there are any negative consequences or drawbacks to increased levels of positive peace.
Yeah,
or
that's
any
that's a
negative correlation with economic.
Yeah, look, it's Oh, I can give you one. That was a good question. I haven't had that one before. So one of them you would say is consumption. Okay, and so there's a byproduct of that in terms of CO2 emissions, and byproducts of that in terms of sort of just the use of the resources on the planet. So look, if there's one, that's it. But so I guess that'll be seen as the major one. But just moving down that track a little bit, one of the facts which just always blows me away each time I think about it. So if we look at the biomass of all mammals on the planet, and we're just talking mammals, 60% of them is livestock, 36% of them is human beings, and 4% is other mammals. That gives you an idea of just how unsustainable the humanity is unless we sort of do something about addressing it. And it's not easy, Part of it's a byproduct of overpopulation. So if we had a billion people on the planet, even 2 billion, 3 billion people, be fine. We would have never heard of the word climate change or CO2 emissions, and the world would be very, very sustainable. So now, if we look at that and we start to break that concept down a bit further, if we go to China, for example, each woman in China is averaging 1.3 children. Now, China's government's trying to up the birth rate, but they're very, very hard to do. So it's governments, particularly when they've got strong powers, they can reduce through a whole range of things the birth rates, but it's very, very hard to have women to have children when they don't want it. So that's the most populous country in the world. If we went to India, and so things there are sort of looking up as well, which is surprising. So if we look just in the last year, if we look at the replacement rate, it's now below the population rate. So for each woman now, she's having less than 2.1 kids. And so that's a positive sign there as well. Now, the area of the world which is most troubling from that angle is if you went to Africa. The projections on growth in population over the next 30 years is 90%. So you've got 11 countries in sub-Saharan Africa where the population will increase by more than 100%. Niger will have the largest increase at 161%.
Okay, thank you. And actually, your answer is linked to the next question on how does the concept of positive peace leading to increased development link to the idea of degrowth?
Yeah, well, so what would get us to degrow? Okay, what would get us to degrow? I would think that positive peace in many ways would create the environment to do that. So there's a lot in positive peace we haven't covered. We just hit one sliver of it tonight, which is around business. So one of the other things associated with the resilience and adaptability. So countries which are high in positive peace have more avenues for adaptability. And part of that comes back to sort of just the structures and the flows within the society. They seem to be able to adapt. So when they have shocks, they seem to be better at coping with their shocks. And then they're also better at recovering from those shocks as well. And there's a whole lot of different things which come into that. But if we come back, what we need is new economic models. And those models aren't really here as yet. Okay, but one can envision what they're like. So we use GDP at the moment as the major counter, and all governments do it, as the major counter of their success. In many ways for governments, that's great because the bigger your GDP, it shows how much weight you've got compared to other countries. However, GDP is a very, very poor measure because what it does is it counts all the things which are harmful to society as well as a positive. So if we look at sort of the intake of drugs like alcohol and tobacco there, we look at polluting industries, they're counted in there, gambling's in there as well, and we could go excessive arms industries there as well. If you need security guards, you'll count that as a positive because the crime rates are too high. And so there's a whole range of different negatives. But also, one of the big flaws, it doesn't take into account a capital account. So capital account then sort of so if your house burned down, for example, that'd be a positive for GDP because you'd have to go out and build a new one, spend all the money to do it, but hardly positive for society or the capital account. That's particularly important when it comes down to looking at the natural environment. We haven't got that built into the accounts. So first phase for me would be building something into the accounts which actually covers the natural environment and other assets as well. Okay, so there's all sorts of assets there, like the roads, the road networks and other things. So you can start to build that in and get it the size of the capital account. And then there are other ways of being able to do it too. And that comes down to sort of what do you want to encourage within your society as expenditure, okay? So marketing, and all of us in business, we use marketing all the time, but marketing does encourage consumption. So there are ways of being able to encourage different forms of marketing which market the things which contain less consumption, okay, less things to bring together. So they're just some isolated thoughts off the top of my head, but it's a big subject, really important one, great question. But at this stage, the model is not there. Maybe whoever asked the question, go away and invent it.
Thank you very much. So we have a next question, more related to business. The question is, what can companies do to contribute to positive peace, such as lobbying governments?
Yeah, well, so one of the things I think is really good, okay, so all of us in business, we work within industry associations. So by proselytizing these kind of concepts to business, then as a lobby group, or as a lobby group, I won't use the word lobby group, don't like it that much, as an influencer, they now present those kind of facts to government and try and get them to create the environment which is congenial for business, but also ends up congenial for a whole range of other things we want, like better peace, higher measures of well-being and happiness, better performance on ecological measures, better performance on measures of development.
Okay, thank you. And this also partly answered the question on how can one activate positive peace.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I think so. It comes down to a whole lot of things. So, really, positive peace, it can be a top-down or bottom-up process. So we've obviously done, if you look at the presentation here tonight, that's really looking at the top-down approach. So that's looking at sort of the factors around government. So what we encourage governments to do is take a better look at the factors around positive peace and use them as a guide by which to try and build the development of their countries. Now, the other areas sort of from the grassroots up. So we've got a whole range of different programs. We work with a lot of organisations all around the world on positive peace, which you can implement at a community level. And so, look, you can use positive peace as a framework in a school. So if you take, for example, so we work with Rotary. And in Uganda, there's a Rotary Club there, Sissi Islands Rotary Club from memory. And they were doing a literacy project in the school. So and we trained a couple of hundred people on positive peace and how to implement it in Kampala. And one of the gentlemen who was on that course was running a literacy project in a really poor school in a rural area in Uganda. And so they've been at it 2 years, no advancement in the literacy. So they then decided to implement and look at the project through the lenses of positive peace. And this is how you can get systemic about a very, very small community project. And there's hundreds of these examples. So they went in, sort of looked at it, looked at well-functioning government. That involved getting the village elders in and the leaders in the school, look low levels of corruption. That was stamping each of the items donated to the school that came from belonged property of the school, and then checking the inventory every 3 months, free flow of information, was speaking to the press. But the two things which really made a difference, and when I hit the difference in a minute, you'll find this, it'll blow your mind away. So the first one was acceptance of the rights of others, and that was sanitary pads for girls because they didn't have it, and a lot of the time the girls weren't turning up 4 days a month. And that sort of discouraged them from school. They'd leave school early, then they'd have more kids. And so keeping them at school really does reduce the birth rates. So they implemented some separate routines for them and gave some sanitary pads. But the other thing, which you'd never hit on looking at a straight project, the literacy project, was relationships with neighbours, because the kids at lunchtime, because they're hungry, were going out and raiding the fruit trees in all the neighbours' properties. And these really poor places, every apple, every orange is considered valuable. So they planted fruit trees in the play yard so the kids could eat off them, then introduced a porridge feeding program at lunchtime, which literally costs a couple of cents a kid. Like, this is cheap. So what happened then was the enrolment rates at the school went up 200%, okay, became massively crowded. And the attainment, the scholastic attainment within the district, where 30% of the kids were in the top 2 grades, it jumped to 60%. Now, why did they get so many kids at the school? They were using free flow of information. They're talking about the program on the radio station. Why did they get the improvement in the scholastic rates? Because the kids, their brains weren't getting enough nutriments to concentrate through the latter end of the day. When the parents heard that they get a free meal at school, that was less they had to worry about. They took their kids and made them go to school, where before that, they were getting them to go out and scrummage for food. That was a long answer, but I love that story.
Yes, thank you. Long but very clear. The next question is, should contribution to positive peace become an indicator of a company's sustainability performance? And how do you see this happen in
practice? Yeah, that's a really, really good question. Okay, so you'd need to, so we haven't applied it in terms of, let's say, some sort of ESG measure for companies. But look, so what you do is you come around and you look at each of the different pillars and see what the company was doing around those pillars. So well-functioning government, like that comes down to how's the company run? What's the structures of running the company? The other thing which comes into it as well would be, let's say, things like free flow of information. You've got the right levels of communications. That's horizontally across the company, whereas company coming down. I guess good relationships with neighbours. That'd be the ability about a partner. How well do they partner? How well do they work in ecosystems? Could look at it for something like that. Equitable distribution resources. I do mean that does not mean equal distributions of resources, okay? So equitable distribution resources, really the social contract. Does the people within the company feel sort of that the incentive systems are fair, okay? It's as simple as that. So there's a couple of ways up. High levels of human capital, okay? Like you don't need PhDs for all positions in all companies. But high levels of human capital, how are you going about developing the skills of the people you've got working for you? And how does that fit in with the overall objectives of the company? So you've got all sorts of ways like that you can do it, but we haven't actually developed the framework as yet.
Okay, and actually the next question might complete the previous one. So how do ESG ratings take into account peace in their current methodology, if they already do so? And how could this methodologies be improved to reflect risks or opportunities?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on ESG, but you've got the environment. Our view of the environment, it's not shoot how well you've got your positive peace. So if your positive peace functioning well, you tend to do a lot better on ecological scores. Governance, so obviously a lot of the aspects of the governance are very, very important. So in gender, it's part of positive peace.
Okay, thank you. Then we have a question about the 8 pillars of positive peace. Which one would you say has been the most difficult to achieve, resulting to a barrier to achieving positive peace historically?
Well, I think if we look at it, it varies from country to country. I'll just come back on the ESG. So one of the other things, the second part, the S is sustainability. So certainly positive peace is related to resilience. Resilience and sustainability aren't quite the same, but they're very, very similar in most incidences. So we come back and we look at probably if we look over the last decade globally, the low levels of corruption, also corruption globally has deteriorated over the last decade. So that's probably the weakest of the 8 pillars. And so that's probably the best way to look at it. We also have another way of being able to slice and dice the positive piece as well. And that's broken up into attitudes, institutions, and structures. So structures that will, over the time, are just continually improving, but they're things like access to the internet, life expectancy rates, levels of education, gender equality and such. If you come back and you look at institutions, they've gone up just slightly over the last decade, nothing like what you'd like, but attitudes now globally, they've deteriorated. And like we can see it, particularly in the Western societies. And so this is the area with Western governments where they really need to be able to focus. So there are things, so what I'd say with democracy, in many ways, it is in decline, but a slight decline at this stage. And so I described, let's say, we'll stick with the Western Europe because that's, I think, where most of the people on this call are. So I described it as having squeaky wheels, okay, rather than it's going through a tipping point or falling off a cliff or running out of gas. So now, what are those attitudes which are deteriorating or coming off? They're things like group grievances, fractionalised elites. That's where the elites within society fight amongst themselves. A lot of things around social equity, concepts of misinformation are on the rise. So there's some of the things. Corruption is on the increase in most countries in Western Europe, albeit off very, very low basis. And corruption you can't measure directly. It's really society's perceptions of it. And another way of being able to look at this where you can see it is if we're looking at violent demonstrations over the last decade. They've been increasing about 10% year on year. And at this stage, we can see a lot of the latest wave of demonstrations are anti-vax and anti-lockdown. But once they pass, there'll be another set. And this again is a sign of a social disconnection.
Okay, thank you for the very complete answer. We have a question related to investments. Do you recommend that we use positive P's as a way to identify the moment for new investments, or should we use it as a tool to change the setting we're already invested in?
I'd see it as both. So look, I think one of the things with positive P's, you can look at the country. Well, it depends on the type of portfolio you've got and where you're invested. But you can look at the countries you're invested in, start to get a better understanding of the positive piece. I'm sure Greenfish and IEP can work together to be able to help you with some analysis, with some consulting to help you with some analyses there. I wouldn't see it necessarily as a massively extensive exercise. We've got all the data, we just got to pull it together. So we can take any country and we can take the positive piece framework, which is 8 pillars, but we then knock it down into 400 different measures under that. And then we can take it down to other levels beyond that as well. So particularly for a lot of the more developed economies. So look, I'd say it's a good way of being able to look at the countries which you're strategically investing in. And obviously it's different for the different types of investments. Stock market investments. So if you're into funds, it's very easy to go into a fund, pull out of a fund, move the money around. If you're actually, however, investing in building manufacturing plants or something like that in a country because you like, let's say, the cost of the labour, then I think it's really important to try and understand the positive piece and where it's going, just so you've got a better understanding of what are the countries in which are most likely to be viable into the future. Okay, thank you. We still have a lot of questions, but unfortunately we cannot answer all of them. Maybe we will finish with the last question. What is the time delay between investments in positive P's and increased rankings on your various indices, like the Global Peace Index, for example? As this is a systemic transformation, how much investment does it require to see a change? Yeah, so one way is to look at it from investment and money. Another way is looking at it in terms of structural change. So in many ways, structural change doesn't necessarily cost money, but it's very difficult to do because it's changing, let's say, the values and the norms within a society. So let's look at corruption, for example. And so if we went down into most of the developing world, the government's tax revenue is not enough to be able to pay a police, the army, people in hospitals, or in the education system. So they've all got to go into business for themselves. That's what's called facility payments. So to change those kind of structures and attitudes, it's a slow process. The stuff which really grinds and keeps companies poor is really the high level corruption at the top. So some things take a long while. Now, the rolling out of the internet, which is it works on free flow of information, and that's really good. It's really good. That has profound impacts. And sort of it's pretty commonplace now, but if I only went back a decade ago and went to Africa and someone in a village got themselves a phone, they now know whether to take their produce and go to a village in one direction to sell it, or in the opposite direction to sell it, because they can test the pricing out, or whether it's worthwhile travelling another 10 k's to sell their produce because they get a better price again. So little things like that. So that's an example of something which can have effect very, very quickly. Corruption, if you can stop it at the top, and China's been reasonably successful at this, although the corruption has been used for political reasons as well, but it also has lessened a lot of that really gross corruption, which was, let's say, in China a decade, 15 years ago. So free flow of information, for example, that can come down just to regulatory change. So you get the regulatory change and sort of you create an environment so more news media outlets flourish. That's a pretty simple one. Well-functioning government, a lot of that's rules and regulations and laws. Business environment, a lot of times rules, regulations and laws. So if you get all those components right, then the money will flow for the investments, okay? And so that's why you get foreign direct investment twice as high in countries improving the positive peace compared to countries which are deteriorating. And as we could see, profits are 27% higher. So if the profits are up, then the companies are investing more money. And so you've got now starting a virtuous cycle. So one of the ways we talk about positive peace is virtuous and vicious cycles. And so a virtuous cycle, because it's systemic, it's self-reinforcing. Okay, so some things improve, they cause the other things to improve. And so you've got this ratcheting up for higher levels of success. And similarly, you get the opposite. So if you move up to the Sahel, let's say you've got a conflict area there in the Sahel, you'll find that what will happen is you'll get the conflict, people then will fight over the resources. So they fight over the resources, they degrade the resources further. You may get the rains come for a while, or a peace deal comes, and so there's a break. But as soon as resources get stretched again, you fall back along the habitual fault lines and off it goes again. That's a vicious cycle.
Thank you very much for all these clear answers. There's still some questions. Unfortunately, we can all not tackle them all, but we still have 2 webinars to come. And I will leave the floor to Flore to present the next.
Yes.
Well, there's one question I can see there in the chat, which is a good one. Can PP be fully achieved locally or regionally with a non-PP national framework? Look, if you go back and you think about Europe at the end of the Second World War, okay? And so they've really implemented a high positive peace environment without consciously knowing they were doing it. So the answer to that is yes, it can be done.
Excellent. That's a good note to finish on for all of us to remember that we can have an impact on positive peace and we don't need to wait for broader frameworks. On this, as Manon mentioned, we are closing the first webinar of a series of 3 webinars. The next one is mid-March in 3 weeks. And it will look at how peace and environmental issues are connected. It will be a practical session that will look at the ecological threats relevant in the business world. And I really encourage you to join this webinar, so please subscribe. You should have already received a link, and we look forward to seeing you again in 3 weeks. I hope this webinar today was interesting and instructive for all of you, as it was for me. Steve, thank you so much for your presentation and for answering all of the questions, or most of the questions in the chat. I believe you will have much more homework to do to answer the remaining ones, but we will be helping you on this. I look forward to seeing everyone really soon.
Yes, thank you to our both speakers today for the insightful information, and thank you, Steve, for answering all the questions.